Venri. Chapter 36. Timeline. 6 months after arrival in Cyprutine. Garrus. Diplomacy and politics between Earth and Palaven were not the ultimately inspiring and cooperative things they had been during the war. Now it seemed more like voracious entities arguing over how carcasses were to be divided. It was ugly, laborious, and potentially dispiriting work. He and Moram were very good at it. It was up to them to inform potential deal-makers that the carcasses were in fact living planets, and that they were not spoils. Many of the new diplomats were raw and unpolished. Moram called them nouveau douche. It had taken her about half an hour of explanation regarding language and human anatomy to explain that. He hadn't thought it was worth it. She thought it was hilarious. His deadpan receipt of that information made it even funnier for her. Palaven had fared as Earth had, an approximate 40% survival rate. Some clans had been decimated. A great deal of leadership was lost. As was often the case in war, the young and the brave died early, and the wily and manipulative lived through the ordeal. The comparisons of diplomacy to war had made Garrus realize that on his own, he would have been one of the young and the brave. He was counted among the wily and manipulative only due to her efforts. He'd have likely died defending the Citadel had Moram not taken him up on his offer. Well, he called it an offer. She'd often reminded him it had been phrased as an order. That he was going with her. In retrospect, he'd even developed a backward appreciation of his time on Omega, and how it had brought about the hardening of his tactics, the sharpening of his instincts, and the up-close realization of what no law meant to some people, and the lengths to which they would go to profit from suffering. He wondered if Moram occasionally found a backward appreciation of having been dead, but didn't ask. Maybe she had some answers others didn't, fears that no longer concerned her. He focused on her being alive. She was happy. She was really happy. The small, tense lines in her face and the habitual strains and stress in her voice that he didn't think she'd ever be able to hear or alter, even if she knew they were there, were now gone. She'd taken up the mantle of her own happiness for him. He volunteered to carry her for eternity, but she wanted to walk. She walked on half-whole legs with joy. Some of the personalities involved in their daily work made Udina look kind. Although Garrus regretted not being able to shoot people outright, it was satisfying to ruin them through other means. They had other means in abundance. Liara had provided Garrus and Moram with informants and recruiters and knowledge of both from her time as Shadow Broker. Farron was now the Shadow Broker, and they had his help as well. The work was also satisfying in other ways, unexpected ways. A perfect headshot was a wonderful thing, but there was no story to it. Diplomacy had stories. When they ruined someone or elevated someone, they knew exactly why. It suited his sense of justice. Building schools, feeding people, reuniting families. These things had a satisfaction to them that headshots did not provide. Their weapons were now upfront diplomacy and charm, but backed up with the real diplomatic tools used throughout history, backroom deals, and insider information. It was very dangerous. They had held dangerous jobs for years, and this held the insidious potential that indoctrination had held. Garrus saw all too easily how people were manipulated, turned, and used. Security was a major concern. As they went out of their way to rob the greedy and spiteful of power, the greedy and spiteful did as they always did and attacked, instead of cutting their losses. Garrus was able to draw from the best of the military and clan to form his own security teams. Kasumi also fed them with pertinent information. With the combined efforts of Kasumi, Farron, the Alliance military, and the Primarch's access to intel, nobody made it into their presence as a guest or support personnel without passing security that Garrus quadruple-checked. If Morim had been a beautiful and terrible thing to watch during battle, watching her at work with diplomacy was the same sort of experience. Instead of ending lives, she was making or breaking reputations and deals, playing with the fates of clans and nations and worlds. Sometimes lives still ended, suicides and murders and death through underestimating security were possible outcomes. Their days were taken up with conferences, their evenings taken up with dinners and dances and events. They were currently in attendance at a dinner and dance this evening for heads of state. Morim's dancing was now impeccable, with all of the practice she'd had, and he'd learned more human dances. The evening had proceeded well until one of their least appreciated job hazards, in the form of Ventralin Caspis, had presented himself. He was the son of an influential Ava, and he fancied himself powerful. But the most he really could aspire to was being obnoxious. He had the calculated bad taste to ask Morim to dance to Turian music. Ventralin being Turian and male, and Morim being bonded to a Turian male, it was insulting according to Turian custom. Morim, however, chose not to be insulted, and accepted the invitation. Garrus chose to not be insulted along with her, as that was what diplomats did. Knowing Ventralin, Garrus appreciated the notification to his visor when Morim opened an audio and video channel to their dance and conversation. He almost felt sorry for Ventralin. This would not go well for him. Morim wouldn't have notified Garrus if they were about to discuss card games. Ventralin began by effusively attempting to snow her. Ambassador Shepard, you are lovely this evening, as you are every evening. I'm certain you couldn't find someone more appreciative than I. Garrus couldn't see Morim's face, but at events like this she was always on stage, her facial expressions tuned to each moment. He imagined to Ventralin she looked neutral, receptive, and slightly indulgent right now, which matched her voice. My thanks, Ventralin. I'm certain I do not need to search for someone. We are wise enough to know the answer to that question. Ventralin paused, trying to sort through that one, and Garrus suppressed a smile. Garrus was able to listen to the conversation he was in, and the conversation he was monitoring, as presently all that he was required to do was to look attentive. Garrus was listening to a particularly boring diatribe on trade customs from a querulous and opinionated human male of advancing years and declining fortune, and all he had to do was look concerned and nod solemnly occasionally during any pause. This conversation had no bearing on anything in particular, unlike Morim's. Ventralin recovered. I'm merely brushing up on my human customs. It is acceptable for a human male to ask a human female to dance. Since I wish to take up residence on Earth, it is best that I learn the customs there, human females being fascinating. Morim's voice reflected amusement, but she was not friendly. It would seem you wish to insult your heritage in order to flatter another heritage that better suits your current needs. I have certainly thought about what you requested in our previous meetings. Ventralin pouted. But that is business. This is pleasure. Oh, is it? It appears that someone has been buying up land, somewhat anonymously and somewhat less anonymously. Someone that looks like you. That is entirely my business. That is what I do. Of course it is. Speculation is what you do. What I should tell you is that it also appears that this anonymous land has all been geared toward controlling water rights. Had you succeeded in your speculation, you might have cut off water to adjacent farming ventures and living communities. Ventralin nearly tripped. Had I succeeded? Yes, of course. Had you succeeded? With Earth's recovery paramount to my job and that of my bondmate, you are aware I have a bondmate? One who might be insulted by you asking me to dance? Were he not kindness incarnate otherwise? Garrus almost barked a laugh, but he turned his involuntary twitch into an unnoticed nod and a prompting, to his oblivious conversation partner. Garrus would dearly love to add a few holes to Ventralin, but this was better. He watched as Ventralin's jaw worked in helplessness, mild panic lighting his eyes. I of course meant no insult. Of course you meant every insult. You will find that it would perhaps be best to leave Cypertine and abandon your land grab on Earth. Fortunately, or unfortunately, depending upon your point of view, the land you acquired is otherwise useless for your intended purpose without a very few pieces of land that are no longer available for purchase. Ventralin's eyes went hard. I have had deals for that land hanging for months now. Oh, yes, I know. It is a shame that you were led to believe that some pieces of land would be available, just long enough to allow you to buy others at inflated prices. It does seem unfair. Your clan will blame you for the loss of a great deal of money on now undeveloped and useless land that you bought in an attempt at extortion. Now it's a tax liability to your clan. You could certainly try to sell it at a huge loss. I've spoken to your Ava. She and I are in agreement that it is best that you go to your clan outpost on Kefit. I believe there is a vermin issue there that you can address. If you sign the land over to her, a buyer for a better deal than you will be able to get will present themselves to her. Ventralin fumed as Garrus was entirely pleased with himself and his bondmate. There was no way this wasn't fun. The panic in Ventralin's eyes intensified. This isn't over. Garrus lost the urge to shoot Ventralin and gained the urge to tear him apart with his talons for threatening her. Diplomats didn't do that either, and that was a shame. You asked for this dance, and it is indeed over. If in the future you wish to step onto the floor again, do be sure you know the music and your intended partner. I enjoyed it. If you did not, perhaps you should not repeat it. Moram cut the feed and walked to Garrus's side, and he excused himself to speak to her. She linked an arm through his, and they walked to a window, having found that presenting their backs while appreciating a view often kept them from being interrupted. Did you hear that? Yes, thank you. Spared me from an otherwise incredibly boring conversation. Security will ensure he leaves. Or shoot him. I don't care. He's on his way off-planet. What an insufferable ass. We're chipping away at them. And yet they keep repopulating. Yes, it was more definitive when we could just shoot them, but now we have unlimited opportunities for tying up and executing people with words alone. I like the part about the vermin. Timeline. 1 year after arrival in Cyprtine. Shepard. Garrus was happy. Garrus was very happy. Garrus was happier than normal, and for the last year he'd been very happy. He was up to something. Possibly some things. She hadn't regretted for a moment leaving Earth, coming to Palaven, working together. They'd both healed. They'd been embraced by family and had embraced work worth doing. They'd forged a good political atmosphere for the wise and resolute, less so for the grasping and petty. They'd lived in the Vicarian compound in Cyprtine, the clan greatly reduced in number, but fiercely loyal. Moram was a happy honorary aunt to dozens of children, learning all about the care and feeding of smaller Turians. This last year had seen the ceremonies for 7 Vicarian teens she knew leaving for their first tours in duty in the military. The first year was traditionally spent on Cyprtine in training, and now in rebuilding. Solana had taken on a great deal of Vicarian business. Solana also now had a bondmate, and she and Garrus had been there for the ceremony. Liara and Javik were on Thessia, rebuilding Asari civilization and redefining their understanding of Prothean civilization. Samara and Faler were reunited, rebuilding the monastery. And Moram had supplied funding. Jacob got a little more sleep, and there was a second baby on her way. Miranda kept her promise and ran occasional training clinics on Palaven and was always welcome to dinner. Zaid didn't budge off Earth, and he liked it that way. Rex and Bakara had uncounted children, and Grunt was trying to catch up. Tally was a highly enthusiastic farmer, learning fascinating, to her, things about the acid content in the soil on her land. The Normandy continued under Vega's command, the crew intact, and with calls for shore leave often on Palaven. Seeing Garrus unstressed day to day at work he loved, with family, respected, and sought after, was a revelation. He was beyond the person she had hoped he would be, given the chance. He was patient, wise, and funny. He had just the right edge of irreverence that set him apart from other Turians. Humor was a new trend among Turian youth, as was exploring relationships outside of their own species and declaring love and bond proudly. To Garrus was now a conjugated verb. To use that in a sentence? My daughter went to an outpost and she came back with an Asari bondmate. She Garrused me. Younger Turians wanted to emulate his style, so at ease with other species, so happy in his choices, without false humility or overbearing pride. They particularly liked the willingness to buck tradition and make honest statements, daring someone to argue. That contributed to his heroic air and his name's new status as a verb. Their roles had fluctuated again, as they had often during their relationship, neither one of them being exactly in control, but circumstances weighing things in favor of his authority. He was among Turians. He blundered less. He charmed more. He was the person who drew the eye. She got her fair share of attention, but the female Turian gaze was much more riveted to him than the male Turian gaze was riveted to her. She liked it. Good for him. As for the Turian ladies and ladies of other species who coveted her mate, nah, 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 nah. She was lucky and could afford to be outwardly gracious, but she was truly inwardly smug. And he was up to something. Fortunately, all the things Garrus got up to were good things. So she didn't have it in her heart to be suspicious or worried. His patterns had subtly changed, small actions and absences, and then bigger and longer ones, building to some unseen crescendo. She knew his work patterns, and he was away from the compound more often, secluded more often. It was a good thing, joyous energy seeming to bubble from his plates, rise off him like steam. Whatever it was, she was glad of it. When it was time for lunch, she had gone to his office, and he'd informed her that they were taking the rest of the day off, that he'd cleared it in advance with her assistance. They were going for a ride. Do I get to find out why you're so happy today? You know the answer to that one. I'm happy because of you. So you're not going to tell me? He pulled her out of the office, out of the building, and into a shielded vehicle in an underground garage. No, I'm not going to tell you. But I'll show you. They drove out beyond the borders of the city proper. She tried to engage him in 20 questions, but he said he had no idea what a bread box was and that he wasn't going to tell her. He was going to show her. Passing several security checkpoints, they went inside a massive, encircling wall onto the grounds of what looked like a museum. It was definitely a new building, landscaped plants just beginning to find their way. Externally, the building was composed of what looked like mirrored glass in shades of gold and silver. No identifying signage. No clue where they were. He drove to another underground parking garage and offered her his hand, helped her from the vehicle, and then lifted her into his arms. To the startled look on her face, he said, "Thresholds. There's nothing about carrying a woman over a threshold into a museum in human tradition. We're making new traditions. This isn't a museum." An elevator brought them up into what looked like an atrium, sun slanting through the glass, the inside bright with plants. Earth plants, definitely. A conservatory? She smiled as she looked around and said, "This is beautiful." She wondered if they were intended to be botanical gardens. Someone had just put this here. "I'm glad you like it." He carried her through the gardens, through corridors, the building moving along Taurian lines. From the inside, it did look much like a madlace, carrying the same themes, fractal patterns, central rooms, huge gathering spaces, branching out to more rooms with their own satellites, all encased in the warming glass, lushly landscaped with earth plants and flowers inside. She pointed. "Look! Races and Lelics." He laughed and nuzzled her throat, continued to carry her through to what looked less like botanical gardens and more like functional living space. An office. She looked closer. An office with her things in it, or duplicates of much of what she liked. Adjoining another office, a wall of the same glass between, filled with things he liked. Her brows drew together. "Is this a new embassy?" He shook his head and carried her through that office to another nest of rooms. This one definitely for a residence. A bedroom. A bedroom with their things in it. Closets of clothes, a Taurian and a human bathroom. Her jaw dropped. "Are we staying here?" Looking out through the expanse of glass, there were high-security walls cloaked with more terraced landscaping. There were Taurian plants on the outside. Inside there was a wall lined with tulips. "There, I've carried you over all the important thresholds. We will stay here, only if you like it." He put her down on her feet and watched her as she walked around the room, fingers trailing over fixtures and fabrics and flowers. "How could I not like it? This is amazing. How did you find this place?" "This place is your madlace." "My madlace?" Is this a new Vicarian building? No, this is the Shepard Madless. She raised a brow. Garrus, there are two of us. She noticed suddenly that the tulips were the color of her tattoos. He shrugged. For now. This would house an army. He took her hand. Good point. We should get started on that. He walked her out through a different exit, through labyrinthine passageways. She noticed belatedly that Shepard colors were a recurrent pattern. Earth plants and offices and bedrooms and kitchens and a ton of people. She heard them before she saw them. Garrus brought her to the heart of the Madless, the central room, vaulted, arched silver and gold-tinted glass in a dome overhead. There was a raised central dais, people sitting in the four quarters. She smiled at a few individuals she knew. Many, many people she did not know. Lots of Taurians. A few humans. Lots of Taurians she didn't know. She knew mostly Vicarians, diplomatic corps, military. This wasn't an ocean of blue faces or enough recognizable uniforms to represent people she knew. What the hell was going on? She looked at Garrus, assuming he was going to say something in the huge room full of Taurians. Was this a housewarming? Garrus stood behind her, his hands on her shoulders. He spoke loudly enough to be heard by the entire room. Rincan has passed. Moram Shepard has seen her way through the bonding of her mate, the creation of her own clan, her service to her purpose, and the passage of time. Her clan is established, and I stand with her in the Madless of Clan Shepard. Who else stands with her? Every person in the room stood. It was a lovely housewarming for a huge museum of a home. Taurian ceremonies didn't have much in the way of words. She was sure this was for her benefit. She wanted to say thank you for the welcome, but Garrus bent his mouth to her ear. These people have applied through me, as your Rincan representative, to join Clan Shepard. They are the first of many. There are more applicants, and I know you enjoy troubled children. These are the first of your clan, if you accept them. If you accept my judgment in their admission. Moram's spine froze. What? You couldn't have given me a heads up on this? She felt him shrug. I thought you liked big surprises. You surprised me with a planet and a job. I'm only authorizing a house and a family. Much smaller as things go. You could say no, just like I could have said no. Say yes. Her lips twitched. What do I have to do? Anything you want. There are no Shepard ceremonies yet. You could keep it very simple and say, welcome. Moram looked around the room, the standing people looking apprehensive. She'd have to ask later how in hell, why, but for now. She turned to the four quarters of the room, Garrus turning with her, his hands still on her shoulders. She said, welcome, in Taurian and English to each section. When she was still, there was a huge cheer, stomping of Taurian feet, and some scattered human clapping. The first of many? She turned in Garrus's arms. How many people are here? How many more? He smiled down at her. 500 now, here. There are over 2,000 more who have applied. I approved those that seemed most compatible first, those who were already on Palaven and could get here without great cost in case you rejected them. You can review the rest. You can also banish anybody that you want. Changing or joining clans is permitted by application and other special circumstances normally, but this is a unique historical circumstance. The Primarch has allowed membership of non-Taurians in Clan Shepard as the founder is human, and I pointed out to her that it would be insulting to limit membership along species lines. That right may spread to other clans if they request it. These are people from decimated clans, or people who admire you, people who admire me, people who admire our work, people who want to try new rules and new ways. These are your people. You are their Ava. She felt tears begin to fall. Our people. He wiped the tears from her face, kissing along the paths. Our people. He pulled her hard to him and dipped her into a deep kiss to a renewal of cheering and stomping feet. You grab the girl and kiss her like you mean it. Garrus pulled her up to her feet and moved his fingers over her cheekbones. Go meet our people. I need to do something. I will be back soon. I don't think I can take any more surprises. Oh, I think you can. I have faith, Venri. She watched him go. A few people were filing out as he was through the exits of the room, but there were hundreds more to meet. She put out her hand to the first person she didn't know and started introducing herself to her new family. She was good at this, meet and greet. It was a requirement of her job as a diplomat, and she had no hesitation in embracing people that Garrus had chosen. About an hour later, when she was having an animated conversation with a group of Turians and humans, discussing the potential hopes and structure of the clan, she felt Garrus's warm hands on her shoulders. She turned to look up at him and stopped with a gasp when she saw his face. He was smiling at her solemnly. His Shakarian markings were gone. The paint on his face was now a vibrant red, markings matching hers along his cheek plates and mandibles. She lifted a trembling finger to trace along the lines of his face, transformed by the jolting change in ornamentation. His eyes were no longer reflected in the faded and chipped blue she'd known for years. Now his face was polished and redrawn in fire. He covered her hands with his as she moved her fingers along the angles and lines of his face. I must inform you that you may no longer claim protection of Rinkan, Ava. You may no longer address me as Shakarian. Her mouth opened, and then she closed it, and then she opened it again, his eyes growing warmer at her hesitation. She was torn between the loss of his markings that made him so distinct to her, and how much pride he took in this grand gesture. She was swept away in the waves of emotion and meaning that had guided him to bring her to this moment. She knew the pride of the Shakarian clan that they'd sheltered with this last year. She didn't understand, hadn't expected that he'd take Rinkan, a political convenience for an individual exceptional desire, and expand it to encompass a dream of family and freedom, used it to forge a path to the future. He'd taken the idle fantasy of her skin in moonlight and her hair in sunlight, and built a madlace of glass, with the flowers and beauty of earth lining the walls. This meant Shepard clan would not pass into obscurity. This meant she had the full support of family. Family. With this, they could have children. A place where they would be safe. Of course they could have children now. Of course that was why he'd done it. He wasn't content allowing her to give up a dream. Even a dream oddly framed and made of fantasy wisps and otherwise abandoned because it was impossible. She'd have been happy with being around Vicarian children, the glancing and oblique experience of immersion in family. She'd learned that it was magic and mundane, belonging. Loving and knowing more people didn't draw her away from Garrus. It gave them more shared experience, taught them more about each other and their separate cultures, giving them places to meet. Community and family grounded them, stitched them to the immediate, to precious time. Time together had once been an impossibility, and now it was a constant, an ocean, unbounded and unhurried, now that they had their lives together the way they wanted. The extended family of representing Earth, of being surrounded by Vicarians, had left her with nothing more to ask. She would have been happy, had been happy being an honorary Vicarian. The people inside these walls right now, humans and Turians, they wanted to be here because they wanted to have family and children as well, across bounds of culture and species. She wasn't alone in her dream. Garrus as a verb stood for this, creating a future, drawing together hope and family and making them whole. He'd been insisting on being called Shepard for years, and she thought it was only out of loyalty, to keep her company. But it had been and would be much more than that. It was ownership and intent. Her mouth dropped open and stayed that way, and he pulled her into his arms, her face against his chest, his hand closing over the back of her head, cradling her close. Her glib tongue, the charm she wielded so easily, the cutting and sharp and witty, were all gone. She was speechless. She kept her head down, storms of realization swirling in her mind. She tried to think of things she might say. Like, "Can I still call you Frying Pan? I don't deserve this. I can't believe you did this." But she could believe it. He was. She babbled softly. He could hear it. She knew. She spoke into his chest, letting some thoughts pass and keeping some back. "Venri, Garrus, thank you. I don't deserve this, and I know you think I do, but I don't deserve you. I am the luckiest person ever born, ever to draw breath, and I want to earn that every day. Thank you, Venri, thank you. I don't have the words." He kissed the top of her head and held her close. "You don't need words, Ava. And you don't need to earn anything. You are welcome. May this madness bring you joy. May your family bring you life." Speechless is good. I like speechless. It seemed she wasn't going to stop crying anytime soon, Any intended family members of hers had best get used to seeing her cry. She lifted her head, traced her fingertips over the bright markings on his face, looked up at him. "Thank you, Garrus Shepard." He'd given her back her name, and she wouldn't allow the name Shepard, ever, to hold a moment's disgrace or hesitation for as long as he held it as his own. She owed it to her new family to let the past drop away and embrace those simple syllables in new light. The look in his eyes as she said those words, framed in his new markings, let her know she'd said the right thing. She looked around the room as it filled with people who had their markings either redone or newly applied to hopeful faces. Timeline: 2 years after arrival on Cyprotine. Shepard. Shepard clan had family units living together in separate quarters in the Madless or in Cyprotine, but also community living spaces. Children could be left safely in the Madless while parents went out into the world. There was care and schooling here. Turians had worked out community living over the millennia of clan evolution, and the basic economics and work sharing of her clan followed Turian traditions. Individual clan members contributed according to their ability, and the clan as a whole was responsible for the welfare and care of each individual. Money, even with this huge group and ostentatious Madless, was not a concern or worry. Clan Shepard had attracted many people already wealthy in their own right, contributing much and drawing back little. The clan was ostentatiously funded. Their personal fortune had grown, even with the expense of the construction of the Madless. Having Kasumi and a shadow broker supply stock tips was invaluable. There had been outrage. Of course, there was always outrage at the inclusion of other species in a new clan. Countering that was stark and solid Vicarian support and the enthusiasm of the Primarch regarding new beginnings. The outrage had burned itself out mostly, now belonging to those who were inclined to anonymous open letters and sour grapes. There were snipings and attacks, metaphorically, in the media toward the clan as a whole, and at her in particular. They usually went after her, and not Garrus. Garrus was infuriated by the attempted character assassination. There was an odd and diffuse outrage over her running a series of orphanages and schools on Earth, as though she would bring the habit of abandoning children to Palaven and then set up schools, indoctrinating children according to her whims. Indoctrination. It was a very odd note to strike. Someone hadn't done their research, hadn't seen that she had no more direct control over the academies, and that running them had been given to a consulting board of experts in education and development. Most of the attacks were exaggerated lies. But some people wanted to believe exaggerated lies about her. Those defending her had pointed out that she was only a source of funds and fundraising, that she had been an orphan. She'd had to avoid all manner of questions regarding her childhood, but the attacks on her had little impact. She was safe and happy in her own Madless. It mostly affected her because it irritated Garrus when she made a point of laughing at the misinformed attacks. Considering what they'd already faced, it was trivial. She agreed that it was ugly and sad, but it was trivial. She was able to spend all day, if she chose, with the children of the clan. Dozens, and then hundreds of children. She got to know every person who lived under this roof, spoke to those who were off-planet regularly, her personal and professional life filling with purpose. She was no longer alone in any of her endeavors. She had a corps of diplomatic attendants that could handle any issue of diplomacy, in her opinion, better than she could personally. but people still insisted on meeting her, talking to her for some reason. Her opinion or presence inexplicably mattered. She considered herself a true figurehead in this case. She had a superlative support system in the frontier-seeking members of her clan. Everyone shared what they knew with the rest of the clan. Garrus taught marksmanship. She and Garrus taught cross-species hand-to-hand techniques together. She mentored biotics. There was an upsurge of Taurians willing to admit to their biotic potential, and many of them streamed to Clan Shepard, hoping for acceptance, implants, and training. And they got all three. They'd been unable to be themselves in their own clans. Biotics were non-traditional and therefore mistrusted. Biotics had been systematically marginalized. Now it became a civil rights debate whether or not a Taurian biotic was a corruption of nature or tradition. She defined them as people with unique potential, and they deserved the opportunity to explore it. Although she never got another implant, she was powerful enough to demonstrate, train, and guide anybody with biotic potential and a will to learn. There was the public blowback of being accused of raising her own private biotic army. She was proud of her own private biotic army. She'd taught people from all races and biotic potential to say, "Fuck 'em," to criticism, and that they could quote her. Then she gave the more diplomatic answer. Clan Shepard is concerned with the future of biotic rights and cross-species cooperation, and those of like mind are always welcome in our madness. When asked, Garrus would follow up her statement by saying, "I've seen many good reasons for Taurians to disagree with each other. This is not one of them." Everyone in the clan took classes on different languages and was educated in divergent cultures. Garrus was now adept at English. They were learning more languages and had the time to soak it all in. The madness was powered by the accumulated dreams and hopes of individuals, a flow of bright threads crafted into tapestry. She was so happy that there should be more words to describe her state of mind. Ecstatic, joyous, unbelievably lucky. She could find those words in English, Taurian, and Asari. She wasn't adept at the Drell language yet, but she was working on it. The amount of autonomy she and Garrus had over their own lives was unique. Not only were they entirely capable of deciding when or where they were going to be ambassadors for the most part, they also set the law of their own private clan. There were now humans, Taurians, Asari, Drell, and one researching Solarian in Clan Shepard, the latter having shamelessly used her familial connection to Morden to gain access to anthropological research, happily joining the clan to be subject to the law here. The law was pretty easy. It mostly revolved around being decent individuals and honoring the clan, honoring Taurian law, honoring the self, honoring hope. Whatever security hoops Garrus made people jump through, by the time anybody made it inside the madness, they didn't bring trouble with them. They had turned quite a few people away, maybe 1 out of 4 applicants. She accepted trouble, children. But not everyone was a fit for this place, and she grew more fiercely protective of what she wanted to build. She'd gone from recruiting people specifically for their talent for violence to recruiting people for their talent for creativity. Having spent time with lots of violent people, they knew what they were looking for. Military training and even colorful pasts were acceptable. Multiple arrests for assault were not. Any uncovered criminal activity that wasn't outright disclosed also disqualified an applicant. Some of her favorite places in the madness were the kitchens. She spent long hours there, early in the mornings, before work and hustle started. She enjoyed helping to put together breakfast. Asari, Drell, human and Taurian men and women working and eating side by side, sharing techniques and stories. There were children at tables and in chairs, all being fed, all hugged or comforted, entertained and loved. There were crest presses and strokes to fringes, stories told, hands grasped. There were lots of kitchens in the Madless. There were about 1,500 Clan Shepard in attendance right now, 4,000 total members at this point in time, more applying daily. They inducted new members once a month now. They were going to have to build new clan compounds in lots of places eventually, the first few being planned across Palaven, but this one would be the Madless for the clan. When she saw Garrus come through the kitchen, she paused from feeding little Selvi, a 2-year-old Turian girl. Garrus always found her, though she chose the kitchen randomly each day. She imagined he made his own rounds in the kitchens, enjoying greeting family wherever he went, but pausing longer wherever she was. And they'd share breakfast. They were rarely apart for more than 2 hours at a time. While she made rounds through kitchens and checked in with the people, he ran his inspections of the personnel and maintenance of the building itself and of security. She handed Sylvie her spoon and decided she could make a huge mess of herself if she wanted. If she needed a change of clothes, she'd take care of that later. Right now, she wanted to step into Garrus's arms and stay there. She stood and waited behind Sylvie's chair, smiling as he said hello and greeted people on his way to her. Garrus pulled her into his arms and gave her a morning greeting that he also used as a pet name now. Bright Sun. He said the light through the glass in the mornings caused her hair to blaze. He took her face between his hands and kissed her, the bustle of the kitchen moving around them as though they were frozen in time and unnoticed. Although embracing, kisses and tears might have been an unusual thing in most clans, in Clan Shepard, people got accustomed to them quickly. Other members of the clan had taken up the mantle and the right to drop everything and celebrate a mate, a child, an accomplishment with active joy. People were efficient and purposeful, but not rushed. There was always time for love. Her toes curled, and her sense of bliss reinvigorated her system. She seemed to never be out of reverie now. They were never separated for that long, and the stability, the sustained joy of their life seemed to be reflected in the strength and stability of their reverie. Hardly ever out of her blood, as he was hardly ever out of her sight. Their home, their workplace, their lives were all wrapped up in one place he'd built with her in mind so well that she hardly ever left. There was nowhere else she wanted to be. They even held conferences, meetings, and state events here now. Security was so well managed, and the building was so beautiful, that Cypertine could offer nothing like it to state guests. A sudden noise from behind her and to the right startled her, and she turned, grabbed Selvi, got the baby behind her back, and stood in front of Garrus. Kellis, a young Turian man, looked guiltily at her, the culprit having been a pan he'd dropped. It had sounded like a gunshot. Everyone stared at her for a few startled moments, and then Selvi grabbed at Morim's hair. Garrus broke the spell first, his laughter giving the signal for everyone else to start to laugh. Did you just try to protect me from a pan? Morim let Sylvie pull at her hair for a while, and then put her back into her chair, extricating herself by distracting her with the spoon again and putting it into her grasp. Well, I didn't know it was a pan at the time. I thought your response time was lagging. Because it was a pan. I saw it. Your observation skills were lagging. You're supposed to let me do that. Protect you. He looked around the room, raised his hands in exasperation, and asked all the people present, "Isn't she supposed to let me do that?" There was more laughter in the form of snickering, and Kellis said, "I am not taking sides on this." Garrus looked at him witheringly. coward. Kellis returned. I like to think of it as prudence. Moram told Garrus. I claim the right to protect everyone in this room from pans. New rule. I'm vetoing that. You can't. You haven't the authority. And nobody has to take sides, because the next pan that makes a move is screwed. Sylvie yelled at the top of her lungs, Screwed! And banged her spoon. And there was the mess. Moram started to laugh. Garrus shook his head. She's corrupting the youth. Sylvie is clearly taking sides. Kellis said with a shrug. Corrupting the youth is kind of what we do here. Moram pointed at Garrus as she started cleaning Sylvie up. He started it. Garrus shook his head. No. You corrupted me. I'm sure of it. Moram raised a brow. He's also a liar. Garrus shook his head. That's it. She's corrupting breakfast. He picked her up and threw her over his shoulder, and she shouted, Beware the pan uprising! On their way out. Their rooms were across the compound, but Garrus navigated a hallway and found his way unerringly to an unoccupied living space, opened the door, and then locked it behind them. How do you do that? He shrugged, and she felt his shoulder rolling under her stomach. I'm strong. You're not that heavy. No. How do you always know where there's an empty room? You still underestimate me. It's sad. Granted, it was easier when there were only 50 people here at one time, but I will always do my due diligence. You have a map overlay on your visor? He put her on her feet, his arms coming around her. She leaned back until his arms took most of her weight. She tilted her head back until she was lightheaded. He said in her ear, I have maps, real-time personnel tracking, security, housekeeping, and maintenance schedules, and lockout authorization. Each declaration was accompanied by pulling at her clothes. She'd had a tailor design work clothes that came apart quickly if he knew how. He knew how. Clothes dropped away with practiced ease. That is the most seductive thing I've ever heard. The pans have no chance against you. His hands were tense, trembling, and his breathing fell harsh and heaving on her neck. Both of them had their moods and their moments, and although they disarmed the situation and laughed about the sound of a gun, these things were too deeply ingrained in their psyches to be truly dispelled so easily. Nobody else knew that it had struck a chord that rang deep through the silences and wasn't quiet when the pretense stopped. She'd stood between him and the threat. He had her, literally, finally, and as often as he wanted, in a room all to himself. He'd built this home. He'd controlled it with ruthless efficiency and care. A home she couldn't or wouldn't leave due to the planet's composition and how well he'd built it for her. He'd become the most influential person in Turian politics and culture, surpassing the Primarch by a wide margin. And she'd stood between him and the threat. She wished she hadn't, but she had. She wished she had the instincts now to dive under a table or stand behind him, but she didn't. She wished she'd known by the sound that it was a fucking pan and spared him this. But she hadn't. Just as she could be back unpredictably in a shuttle, in pain, without a leg, or chained to a wall, trapped inside her own head. he could be yanked back to feeling helpless to protect her. She'd stood between him and the threat. She couldn't change that. She couldn't make him a promise. She wouldn't lie to him. She wouldn't tell him she'd be able to let him handle it, let him face the threat alone, no matter how much he wanted her to. She would always fight for him. They'd resolved most of their conflicts and disagreements, and what remained was what was hard-coded in her, something he could never change. She would die for him, and always would, and it made him frantic. They hadn't talked about it because she loved him too much to lie, and he was too smart to believe any of her reassurances. Experience had taught them both the real answer. To him, there was something inherently un-bondmate-like in her behavior. To him, she was a more valuable target than he was, and she didn't see it that way, had never seen it that way, would never see it that way. She could give him all the intellectual and studied authority he wanted, but moments of danger had their own lore and law. This was beyond any logical questions of right-of-way. After years of sacrifice and then years of plenty, she was still the same inherent person she'd been before she'd put on a uniform. In a crisis, she was going to move fast, and she was going to run toward the threat. In this case, the threat had been a pan. But what mattered was that she'd done what she had done, and he had seen it. She imagined how he felt at this moment, as though the flesh were stripped from him, and he were nothing but bone and nerves, raw and unguarded, flayed and fearing. His hands moved with the unique and clashing impulses of patient frenzy, his hard-bitten restraint keeping him from taking out his internal havoc on her. There would be fear, and then an inrush of anger from 1,000 remembered moments. She knew that path intimately. She'd once held his face together with her hands. There was nothing she could say, nothing she could do, other than be under his hands, wait for his words to return, wait for that tsunami of fear and recollection to pass from his mind. He wasn't angry at her. He was angry at himself in irrational ways. In his mind would be spinning the questions of, why wasn't he at the right angle? What if that pan had been a gun? What if his measures had failed? What if she'd died? Again. What if she died again? He blamed himself for her death. Trying to talk about it would not be only futile, but destructive. They were both too good at words, too willing to comfort the other by giving in to an intellectual desire. She'd love to promise him that she'd always be safe. He'd love to convince himself he could always protect her. They both knew neither of those things would ever be true. He couldn't help how he felt any more than she could help what she did. They were both immutable instincts. She imagined his psyche, splattered with the equivalent of hot tar, and they could do nothing but wait for it to cool. Tearing at it would deepen and spread it. She breathed steadily, not matching his harsh breathing pace, not willing to speak, ceding the entire moment to his control. She desperately wanted to comfort him, and she couldn't. Not with words. What she could do would be to stand between him and the threat. she would not allow him to retreat. She would not allow him to be alone in the futile silences. She would not defend herself or try to prove to him that he loved her as she was, reckless instinct and all. She had un-bondmate-like behavior, and that was her deeper truth. But she also loved him, and that was her deepest truth. And she would not say a word. She would stand by him, stand with him, until he took her off her feet, which he would do. The wraith of their past was trailing its cold finger down his spine. But that couldn't survive reverie. He wanted to punish himself, and she wouldn't allow it. He wanted to be separate and be coldly angry at himself, and she wouldn't allow that either. She imagined in him right now the further instinct to run and hide. Things she understood. Storms like this happened between them, but they blew through and they passed. They wouldn't run out or run away from the truth. Their moments in the kitchen also defined who they were. Glib and disarming, setting other people at ease. Her dismissive and distracting humor, his interest in physically removing her from her room in his arms. It had happened enough under less strained circumstances that it wasn't unusual to see her carried through hallways to empty rooms. They had that luxury. Their lives could be interrupted to celebrate each other. They'd structured their bond, their lives that way, and they reveled in the luxury of time, of support, of that tailored and indulged need for each other. What she would allow would be for him to work out his patient frenzy on her body, on her skin, with his teeth and his talons, his hands and his will. The charming, teasing, and calm Garrus that everyone else knew would be gone. Replaced by her bondmate, he would allow her to see that he was broken down beyond words to uncontrolled, unmet need. Her accustomed charm, teasing, and calm would not be of any interest to this man in this moment. He hadn't removed his clothes, only hers. Her weight was fully supported in his arms. He lifted her, turned her, and pressed her against the glass that was spangled by the arc of the sunrise. He didn't speak, and neither did she. She gasped as the cold of the glass contacted and pressed against her breasts, and then she fell silent and still. His hands came up along with her arms, drawing her unresisting hands over her head, secured in the grip of one of his hands. His breathing was harsh and deep, and he pressed his body tighter to hers. Her head was turned so she could see his face, intent and remote from her, allowing her to watch, but not share. He spent uncounted, long minutes breathing hard through his nose and growling softly on each breath let out. His free hand moved to sift her hair through his talons, a meditation of sparking red. That hand embodying gentle patience, his eyes drawn contemplatively as his breath grew harsher and the hand restraining her wrists gripped tight enough to bruise. She knew where he was right now. Primitive and under the influence of different parts of the brain than the conscious mind. He brought out fear in her. Not terror, but her awareness of the overlay of insidious, primal danger, pouring out on her skin like a sheen of oil, making the hair stand up on the back of her neck and on her upper arms. She wondered if he could smell that reaction in her, If he pushed her into positions until she smelled like what he wanted. A dash of pain, a touch of fear, a note of helplessness to match his own. Was it better that way for him? Spirit, she wanted to have a Turian nose, to know that alchemy that he worked. She was bound to her own limitations of sensing. She was so fully out of her league. Again. Always. Her mind was aware that this was not a good position to be in, and historically likely resulting in being eaten. Feeling teeth and hard plate pressed to softer, helpless flesh. Parts of her mind wanted her to scream, or bargain, or struggle. With an effort of conscious will, reinforced each second, she focused on breathing. Her own breath strained along with his. Somewhere either her pace had matched his, or he'd matched hers. He needed her, and she needed him to know that she loved him when he was stripped of his defenses, same as he knew she loved him when she was angry and ready to hit him because he was there and she wanted to hit something. Her anger could always be diffused by his charm and wit and willingness to dare her to hit him anyway because he could work with that. His needs were different. He didn't need or want charm or wit, her words, or her managing him. She was still trying to manage him. She couldn't help it. She was sure, though, that any action she took in any direction would be denied, whatever it was, short of her telling him directly to stop, which he would do immediately. But she would never ask. Primacy. The word came to her in a flash of discordant insight. There was nothing she could do. No way she could serve. He didn't want that, wouldn't allow it, because this moment was inherently about primacy. His focus would be on her, because she was what mattered to him. The violence saturating and knotting his muscles would abate only that way. If he set her free, she'd turn, she'd speak, she'd run her hands over his body, she'd kiss and cajole him into some facile acceptance. It would be comfort, but it would also be a denial, a dismissal of a deeper truth. And he would let her do that. And she wouldn't do that to him. Their experience, the years of bonded life and sex, had taught them a great deal. But it could still be vertiginous and magnetic, flipping poles at will, dropping them through expectations like tearing wet tissue paper. Ego and intent shredded. It was like losing gravity, having no horizon, spinning like a dizzy pilot in a cockpit plunging toward the surface. He would like for her to hold fucking still. She imagined him screaming inside his head that he wished she would stay the fuck down just once. Would she? If he asked? If she knew the choice was him or her? No. She would defy that. She would refuse. Every time. This was why. Together they were going to convince his body into believing he had actual control over her ultimate actions. Just like her mind could be frightened into believing harm would come to her when she knew it wouldn't, they could convince his body to believe no harm would come to her, even though they knew it would. Someday. No matter how hard he worked, no matter how careful he was, she would die. Again. That was a fact, and one he couldn't bear. He looked at the back of her neck and the tiny hairs rising there, and she let out a soft moan. After that sound escaped, his growl was interrupted fractionally, and he pressed to her tighter, ran his hand up her goose-fleshed arm with a sound of satisfaction. He lowered her arms, kept them parallel to the ground, out to the side, gripped in his hands, pulling the skin of her neck and shoulders out taut. She wanted to hold on to her rational mind and hold still, be quiet, be receptive, but that was going to be impossible. The skin on the back of her neck and her tightened shoulders was sensitive and needy once touched. The concentrated and tense nerve endings under his tongue, scraped by teeth and the edges of mouth plates, made her attention pull to that focused spot. Nothing left over for intent, her knees trembling with her held up by him bodily. He knew her body and the different sensations he could pull from her skin. He knew where she was ticklish, where she was sensitive. He'd studied her, and the intimacy of his recursive and dedicated knowledge of what he could call out of her, given any expanse of her skin, brought her one more step away from her intention to comfort him, and further toward... Please, do that again. Right now she didn't know the rules, and didn't really know how to help. She wanted to beg and wanted to hold still. Spirits. Maybe that's what he wanted. That she feel the same chaos that racked him. Need with no relief. Build with no outlet. Whatever he wanted, he could get it from her. Except for that promise. Chaos she could do, especially now. He'd spoken no words, so she'd speak no words. He spoke with his body, so she'd speak with hers. She was pressed so tight to the glass that she couldn't move much, but she could invite him. She relaxed her shoulders, flexed her body back to better fit him, matching the symmetry of his chest to her spine, fitting her ass into the overarching curve of his wide-spaced thighs. He answered that with a growl, and his mouth opened over the back of her neck, drawing points of blood. Her open-mouthed moan turned into a high whimper. He dropped her arms to her sides, and then he drew her back against him with his chin, digging its plates into her collarbone, and his hands on her hip and stomach. His harsh breathing and soft growls were at her ear, as a counterpoint to her whimpers. His hands passed over her skin in unpredictable trails, talons and fingertips along her waist, belly, ribs, breasts, and then back down and around. He dragged his talons over her stomach to feel the shuddering muscles underneath her skin, the twitching reflecting how she'd progressed to involuntary responses under his hands. He lifted her off the ground, his hand at her waist, dragging her up his body, and then a hand tight at her throat as he bit and licked at the skin of her neck that was exposed between his wide fingers. Another shot of fear and a stab of pain, and pressure as her breathing was restricted, not too much, just enough to feel it, and add panic that then dispersed like fireworks along her nerves. He lowered her slowly, his cock digging at the skin of her thighs, pressing and sliding without guidance. He lifted her again, lowered her, and then eased his hold on her weight until she was biting her lip, ready to scream. And then she did half scream, half wail as he bit down harder, drove inside her body at that painful angle, the pain dispersing into a spread of pleasure after a long, suspended moment before he supported her weight again. He leaned back at an angle made possible by his body, impossible with hers. He let out a feral growl. She was arched back against him, renewed and rejoined reverie seeping through and dissolving worry. Finding home. She wanted the same for him, for there to be a lessening of strain, relaxation of his muscles and softening of his voice. Reverie called to her to let go, but it sharpened his focus on her as he pressed his advantage. The hand at her throat moved to play at her clit as she was leaning back against him like a butterfly pinned to a board. He held her suspended and hanging against the unyielding cliff of his body, his tongue, mouth, and growl against her throat, against her ear, drips of purple over her collarbone and down her breast and stomach. He forced and fed pleasure into her, onto her, with a hard, blinding, reverie-drenched orgasm spreading through her body. She was exquisitely aware of how he moved inside her. He was demanding of primacy, unspoken but clear, in intent growls, in the rough hold on her, and the guttural sounds he drew from her, as he squeezed the breath from her and controlled when she could pull it back in. She measured his sense and present-day self coming back through the easing of his shaking, and his hands gentling, his mouth moving from bites to kisses. His growls shifted from demand to approval, to agreement, to adoration. He wore her down, exhausted her, and then carried her to the bed, put her down on the blankets, covered her body again with his as she trembled. He licked sweat and the thin blood trails from her skin, finally allowing and encouraging her to touch him and to kiss him back. He was now patient and satisfied with her unsteady-eyed exhaustion. He held her gaze, rested her hands on his shoulders, and slid back inside her as her head arched back. He rolled over and draped her body on top of him, pulling blankets around her. He would be content to hold her here, like this, for hours. Because he could. And because she wanted that time with him. There was absolutely nothing more important happening anywhere.